So it's a fully managed database. So you don't have to worry about your backups or anything. You can configure that all through a web interface when you configure your instance. So you can configure how long you want to keep your backups, what the maintenance window would be, what the backup window would be. So like you can specify at what time you want your backups to start running, at what times. If you have the maintenance setup where you're going to be upgrading your version automatically, you can specify, at what time of day you want that to actually happen. And there's
ColdFusion Alive, the podcast for the ColdFusion community. Discover practices, tools, techniques, tips and trends for modern ColdFusion development. Brought to you by TerraTech, the ColdFusion experts. Develop, secure, optimize. Here is your host, the founder of TerraTech, Michaela Light.
Welcome back to the show. Today we're going to be talking about moving your ColdFusion site into the cloud with Oracle Cloud Migration with Scott Stroz. And Scott is joining us from exotic West Virginia in the United States of America. And you may not know Scott. He's been doing ColdFusion stuff for years, and he used to run the CFR podcast with, was it Dave, or who are you running that with?
Dave Ferguson.
Dave Ferguson, yeah. And he's the developer advocate for MySQL, which many of the listeners will be using for their database if they're not still on the dark side with SQL Server. So that was a joke.
You said that, not me.
Yes, I'm allowed to say anything. We have complete freedom in this podcast. And he also has been doing software development for, you said 20 plus years. I'm sure in your bio, I'm sure you've been doing it for 25 years.
Not quite.
Not quite. Also done network administration, been an operations manager, and he is also a paramedic. So not only does he deal
former paramedic.
Oh, former.
I stopped being a paramedic a long time ago.
You did? Oh,
yeah. Okay. I'm not certified anymore.
Okay. And as well as ColdFusion, you also do things with Groovy and Grails, Angular, Vue, Micronaut. I think you even mentioned Python and all kinds of other
and Node
things.
Yeah.
And Node. So yeah, lots of cool stuff, lots of experience this man has. So welcome to the show.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
So I think we should start with the, so to speak, elephant in the room. What is this Oracle Cloud thing? Because I'd never heard of it until you mentioned it to me.
Well, I don't like that, but Oracle Cloud is basically, it's our, and when I say our, I mean Oracle's cloud services. So part of that are compute instances, which are like VMs. You can run Oracle database in the cloud as autonomous DB. You can run MySQL in the cloud as MySQL Heatwave. There's storage buckets. There's going to be integration to help with generative AI, and it's not as, there aren't as many features in Oracle Cloud right now as there is in, say, AWS, because AWS has, there's just a ton of stuff in AWS, but what we do offer, we do very well.
Well, that's good to hear. I was just being honest there that I hadn't heard of it until you mentioned it. So it's good that you're coming on the podcast so people can hear about it and realize there's not just AWS or Google Cloud Services or whatever out there. We've got other options available. And
and that's really what it is. It's another option from AWS, Azure, and Google Web Services. But I think the thing that sets Oracle Cloud, or OCI, is that's how the cool kids say it.
OCI.
OCI, wow. Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, which that's a lot of syllables to say. So I prefer OCI. But one of the, I think, advantages we have for people just getting started is that Oracle Cloud has a very robust, always free tier. And it's not, it's free until it's not, like some other providers. It literally is, you can spin up some compute instances without even having to give Oracle a credit card.
Wow.
and you can run those instances, and they're small. You're not going to be able to run a multi-million-dollar company off of it. But if you're just getting started, if you have an idea or you have a small business or a small project you want to use for cloud hosting, then Oracle Cloud is a great way to start it, because I have a small app that I've been using for about 13 years. I manage a golf league, and I wrote a web application to help me manage that golf league. And I've been hosting that on Oracle Cloud now for 5 or 6 years, and I haven't paid a penny for it.
So if you've got a startup or an open source project or a nonprofit or a personal project, might be good option for that.
Absolutely.
And of course, for those who aren't aware, Oracle actually is the I don't know what you want to call it, but the force behind MySQL now. Is that true?
I say the steward.
The steward. Okay.
Yes. So Oracle manages MySQL, and they handle the community edition. So that's the free open source edition that I'd say probably most people who have used MySQL get started with. But we also do have paid for products like MySQL Standard, MySQL Enterprise, and MySQL Heatwave, which Heatwave is actually the version of MySQL that runs in Oracle Cloud. So it's like it's database as a service.
Sorry, got a bit muted there while I was trying to write down what you were saying. Because I'd never heard of Heatwave. I'd heard of the community edition of MySQL. So there's like a kind of, is it a paid edition or a supported edition or what?
The MySQL Heatwave is just the version of MySQL that's available as a service in Oracle Cloud. There are other pieces to it. There's a lot of different functionality that can be added to Heatwave. One of them is an in-memory database that allows you to do analytic queries against your data, as if you had, like an analytics engine. Unfortunately, that is also called Heatwave. So it can get a little bit confusing sometimes. But I tell people that Heatwave is first and foremost the MySQL in a cloud offering through Oracle. So it's a fully managed database. So you don't have to worry about your backups or anything. You can configure that all through a web interface when you configure your instance. So you can configure how long you want to keep your backups, what the maintenance window would be, what the backup window would be. So like you can specify at what time you want your backups to start running, at what times. If you have the maintenance setup where you're going to be upgrading your version automatically, you can specify, at what time of day you want that to actually happen. And there's a bunch of other stuff that you can configure with that. But
so that would compare. I think Microsoft was their offering AzureSQL or some such name, and then I'm pretty sure AWS and Google Cloud have databases there. So this is your Oracle's version of the managed database solution that can scale up and be taken care of.
And the difference between Oracle Cloud's version of the managed MySQL database is that in Oracle Cloud, it's Enterprise Edition. So if you are using MySQL Heatwave in Oracle Cloud, you're actually using Enterprise Edition. But from the other vendors, if you're using their MySQL managed versions, it's actually Community Edition. And with Enterprise, there are some performance boosts and there are some enhanced security features available. There's other stuff that's involved too, but those are the two big ones that come to mind right now. And something else is sometimes the other vendors, they kind of lag behind the most recent version of MySQL. So they could be 1 or 2 versions behind from what you would actually get in Heatwave.
Very cool. I think people who use MySQL really don't see all the power now. I was watching Ben Nadell. He's been playing out with the latest version of MySQL, which I can't remember which version it is, and it doesn't really matter. But the point was he found all these new features that had been put in it, and who knew?
Yeah, there's stuff that we need to try and keep up with the Joneses, so there's new features that are added. I just saw something from Ben Nadell the other day where I was like, I didn't even know we had that.
Well, I
You
think
know, and
I think he must have a clone because he not only does he have a full-time job, but he seems to spend all his time investigating cool software like
exactly.
MySQL and
Yeah.
ColdFusion and what have you, and he finds all these amazing things to do. You know, we didn't know, or features that don't quite work right is the other thing he sometimes finds.
Right.
Not necessarily MySQL. But it's a very powerful database. If you haven't used people listening haven't used MySQL recently, you know, it's definitely improved.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I've been using it for over 20 years.
Wow.
I started using MySQL in my first job as a web developer,
Mm-hmm.
mostly because I didn't have a budget, so I had to use
Okay.
all free open source products. And the Golf League application that I mentioned before runs on MySQL. So I've been using it pretty much nonstop since 2001, I think.
Wow.
Yep.
Is it still open source?
Yes, there is an open source version. There are, like I mentioned, there are some performance enhancements and some security features that are available in enterprise that aren't available in community. But each time there is a new version of MySQL that comes out, the community version or the open source version is updated as well.
Well, that's cool. And then I mean, I'm assuming you sometimes do touch Microsoft SQL Server on various things you do.
Actually, I haven't used SQL Server in quite some time.
Really?
But yeah, it's before I joined Oracle, the projects that I was on, one of them used Oracle DB.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm trying to remember the project before that. Maybe it was the project before that we used SQL Server. So maybe it's been closer than I remember, but
Well, just trying to be as unbiased as you can. How would MySQL compare to SQL Server? Because, 15 years ago, it kind of lacked some of the transactional processing and
right.
other features that SQL Server had. Is that still true, or does it now have that kind of
There's a
stuff?
lot of stuff that MySQL has caught up with, with some of the other vendors. In people, when I go to conferences and events, and people ask, well, why should I choose MySQL over another database? And my knee jerk reaction is because I'm telling you to use MySQL. And but for me, and I was at a conference, and it was actually the first conference I was at as an Oracle employee. And I had somebody come up to me from another open source database, and I'm not going to mention the name. But they seem to want to kind of pick a fight.
Mm.
Like they were like, well, why do you think MySQL is better? And I'm like, I can't tell you whether or not I think it's better because I've never used that other product. And then he called me a liar because I never used the product. And I said, well, me personally, in all the work I've ever done with MySQL, I never had a problem it couldn't solve. And again, he called me a liar. And I was like, it seems you're trying to pick a fight and it's not going to happen. So maybe you should just walk away and be happy with the fact that there's another open source database you can use. It's really kind of weird to see how people are so married to a database.
It's like
I never really, I never
right?
really thought about it so much. And the thing is, I would choose MySQL. That would be like my first choice, and that would have been my first choice before I joined Oracle. But probably because I've been using it for so long, it's the database that I know better than the others. Mm-hmm. So unless I had a problem that I knew MySQL couldn't solve, that's going to be my go-to. That's I know what it can do. I don't know everything it can do, but from my experience, I know what it's capable of. I know it can scale, because we have customers that use MySQL that have thousands of nodes running across the planet. So it scales. For the stuff that I'm probably
you've got thousands of nodes all going, and is this going to some kind of clustered MySQL? I forget what the name of that open source project that's MySQL clustered.
I don't know. I can't speak to to their internal architecture.
Okay.
But I do know that they have thousands of MySQL instances scattered all over the globe. So it's scalable. It's performant. This same customer has, data throughput that even probably 5 years ago, people would be like, there's no way you could get that much data. But they do, and they do it well. So it's
MariaDB was the name I was trying to think of. That's
yes,
like an
MariaDB was actually started by the same developer who created MySQL, and he forked. I forget when, but I know that he had forked the MySQL repo and started MariaDB. Right now, though, it has diverged so much that it's hard to say it's compatible with MySQL. Used to be, almost a one-for-one. If you had MariaDB running, you could run any code against it that you had for MySQL, and that's not necessary.
Yes, we've done that many years ago.
Yep.
But now it's no longer a fork. Maybe it's become a spoon or whatever the correct.
Yeah, it's almost like a completely separate product at this point. And please, people who are listening who might be MariaDB fans, I'm not disparaging MariaDB in any way. I'm just saying I don't think it can be considered compatible with MySQL anymore like it used to.
And is this Michael Monty Wilderness or whatever? That's the guy who
could be. Yeah,
could be. That's what my quick Googling determined. But yeah, it's not totally compatible anymore.
Right.
Things move on. I mean, it's the same story. Didn't Microsoft SQL Server fork off something else? I can't remember what it forked from, but wasn't it an open sourcey thing at some point?
It was years and years and years ago.
Yeah, 25 years ago. But I mean, even Oracle database came out of that RDBMS research that was done like 35 years ago.
Yeah, back in the 70s, I think.
Back in the 70s, yeah.
Yep.
I remember using Oracle, I think it was version 2, or I don't know what it was, some old version on a Max PDP 11. And it was great for the, wasn't any other relational database that actually worked back then.
Right.
So, very cool on MySQL. Definitely worth checking out. You can run it in the cloud, you can run it on your virtual private server, you can run it on your own laptop.
We have Docker images that are available for it as well.
Wow.
Yep.
Very modern. You sound far more hip than,
than the gray hair would indicate.
Well, I didn't want to say that myself, but now you've said it, So
no, it's funny. I only know about the I shouldn't say I only know, but I only use the Docker stuff recently because one of the things that I do in my role is I work with professors, teachers, students to help promote using MySQL in the classroom. And I had somebody reach out to me and say, hey, what's the best way to get this up and running? And I was like, well, probably the fastest way and the least problematic way would be to just spin up a Docker image. He wanted to use it in his class. And he tried doing the installer and he ran into issues, and he was afraid that if he ran into issues, some of the students would run into issues, and he was just trying to mitigate that. So I was like, just, you can try using our Docker images. It's actually pretty easy to get those up and running as long as they have Docker installed or a Docker
command box or whatever.
Yep.
If you're so apparently I just discovered I did know this info. Sybase is what Microsoft SQL Server was for.
Yes, you're right.
And I think Sybase has gone to database heaven and is no longer.
I think you're right. I even remember in my early days of CF development that the driver was the same whether you were hitting Sybase or SQL Server.
Oh, wow. There you go.
I think I'm really dating my CF usage there.
I'm sure you go back to version 1 or thereabouts.
No, not quite. 5.
Oh, 5.
That was the first version I used.
Version of ColdFusion that was written in C.
Yep.
Yep. And it was a great version. Very reliable. And then they rewrote it in Java, which of course that's another little Oracle product, isn't it? Java.
Yep.
Yeah, or at least in one flavor of Java, stewards of Java. That sounds like the next television series after Game of Thrones, stewards of Java. Oh. I think we should ask why you moved this ColdFusion site to Oracle Cloud. Why would you put something in the cloud? Because not everyone. I talk to a lot of people who do ColdFusion development or their CIOs or whatever. Not all of them have moved to the cloud, I have to tell you.
Yeah.
And probably there are people listening who are like, well, why should I do that?
So for me, it's ease. A lot of the stuff that I don't like I don't like doing network administration. I don't like managing servers. I don't like managing hardware. That's, those are like the things I despise least about the IT world in terms of what I've done before in the past. So that kind of takes stuff out of it. It takes that off my plate. Let somebody else worry about it. And I think probably the best excuse, for lack of a better word, you can use for going to cloud is, I think the cloud is the great equalizer. So when you are using cloud computing to host your database or to host your website, you actually are able to afford resources and functionality that you might not have been able to afford if you had servers sitting in your server in your building. And one of the examples I'll use there is, you can spin up a compute instance to host a ColdFusion site, but you can also configure that so that if it gets busy, you can spin up multiple instances during the busy period. And when things get slowed down again, then those instances will spin back down and you'll go back down to just one or two, whatever you have. Now, imagine doing that with a server you have in your server closet. You'd actually have to invest in a brand new server, and get it configured and all this other stuff. And, the way I've looked at, or I've seen things, is I think cloud is very cost effective for smaller companies and very cost effective for very big companies. It's like the medium-sized companies that might not be. So there might be a point in time where you get so big where you need more resources that might not necessarily be cost effective in the cloud for what you need. So at that point, it may be worth bringing stuff in-house. But then once you have stuff in-house, you may grow so big that it's no longer cost effective for you to keep everything in-house, and you go back up to the cloud.
You haven't been reading those 37 Signals posts about how they moved out of cloud back to in-house virtual private servers?
I have not.
Oh.
So, and like, nice, and the other
series
the other really big advantage, when you have a project or a company that gets to a certain size, is that you can have, instances of your website or database, whatever, hosted in different parts of the world. That's going to help with latency. And again, trying to do that in-house, that's hard, because then you got to have real estate in different countries, and there's a whole other set of legal issues you need to worry about. Whereas here, you can just say, what, I want to put this instance in this region, and you're done.
No, it's definitely much easier to spin up servers, scale, and I sometimes wonder when I'm using cloud, is there even a physical machine? I know there are physical machines, but they're like, it's so hidden. You can't tell what physical machine you're running on. Mm-hmm. And if it's a hardware issue, it's just dealt with automatically. You don't have to deal with it. And if you want to add memory, you just click a button and it's added. It's not like you have to order memory from Dell or whoever you're getting your hardware from. You just click a button and there it is. More memory, more CPU, more disk.
Exactly. And you can actually do that and have minimal downtime, if any.
Yeah.
So it really does open up a lot of possibilities, especially to people or companies that might not be able to have afforded them before in the past. And I think that's why it's a great equalizer to me.
I think there's an acronym out there, but I mean, basically it's whatever, DevOps as a service or hardware as a service. I can't think of the right acronym that they use for this. But the whole point is you've outsourced all the network admin hardware stuff that gives you headaches, and then you can just focus on the clever architecture of your app and the programming.
Absolutely.
And ditto with getting a database like MySQL in the cloud. You're not having to manage that database, and you still need a DBA of some kind to like.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Though, how is MySQL on, automatically tuning up the database and all that? Because I know Oracle does a bit of that.
So on my team, there's two of us who are kind of public facing, myself and a colleague I have in Belgium. And he likes to tell people, I'm not a developer, I'm a DBA. And I've actually kind of co-opted that and say, I'm not a DBA, I'm a developer. So when it comes to performance tuning and stuff like that, he's the person that like I would ask questions of, like, hey, Fred, how do we do this? Or, hey, I talked to somebody, they're having this issue, what can I do? And, he's probably forgotten more about MySQL than I'll ever know. But so for DBA type stuff like that, like I know like high level stuff like backups and how to restore stuff, but what a lot of the individual settings do and how that can increase your performance or decrease your performance if you don't do it right, it's not something I've actually been able to wrap my head around yet. And I think part of that's because I don't really manage very large instances of MySQL with, ridiculous data sets. So I do know that you can tweak performance on the Heatwave side in the cloud pretty easily through a web interface.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've seen this trend in databases. I don't know if it was Oracle or SQL Server, where they have some kind of intelligent machine learning or AI kind of auto-tune type thing going on.
In Heatwave, there is some functionality that uses AI and machine learning to help you dictate or help you predict what your usage might be, or it'll determine when you spin up a new instance because things got busy, what shape of instance to use. So there are pieces of Heatwave that use AI and machine learning to help manage things, but I don't think it's completely automated.
Well, it seems like Oracle database does do a bit of that. So maybe eventually that knowledge will make it to MySQL. They have a thing called the Automatic Database Diagnostic Monitor.
Yep.
ADDM. They love acronyms, don't they? So I think this is the trend in databases and in all things computer related, right? We've seen this with ColdFusion, with the Fusion Reactor guys having their little AI monitoring stuff. I know the Adobe folks are like, working on adding AI features in the ColdFusion 2024. So I think there is this trend to like get some help with all the software that we use for building apps to make them more self-healing or self-improving. But a good trend. It doesn't do away with DBAs or programmers. I mean, I saw a little conversation between Mark Takakana and probably with Ben Nadell, and Ben was saying how he tried out ChatGPT to like get, have it code some ColdFusion code, and it kind of dorked it up, and he had to like tell it several times, and it still dorked it up, so he didn't. And Mark was saying, well, first of all, you need to pay for the paid version of ChatGPT and not cheap out on the free one. And secondly, it's like how it's a whole art to ask questions to these AI.
Absolutely.
Train them. So anyway, that's a whole other topic. So I think you've convinced me, and hopefully the listeners, that they should be checking out cloud or hosting stuff, their ColdFusion apps, databases, and data. But why Oracle Cloud? There's a lot of clouds out there.
So I would say probably the biggest reason too is, as I mentioned before, we have a very robust, always free tier. So right now, if you sign up, you can actually get up to 4 compute instances. So they're like VMs in
Oh,
any combination up to 4 CPUs and 24 gigabytes of RAM.
wow.
And that's included as part of the always free tier. So you could have 4 instances, each with 1 CPU and 8 gigabytes of RAM. And I forget the storage, but I want to say it's like 100 gigabytes of storage, maybe. I could be wrong there, though. And you'll never pay anything. That's actually what I run my Golf League site on. And those are ARM architecture, so you need to be careful. Some things can be problematic to run on if you're using ARM architecture. And Lucy happens to be one of them.
Oh,
or did happen to be one of them. They may have gotten it fixed, but I don't know.
It likes a more sophisticated CPU. But Adobe ColdFusion is fine, or?
No, actually, I'm running right now Lucy 5. I want 5.3, I think, maybe. I haven't updated the Lucy engine in quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
So the issue I had was that I had the site and I had the database and ColdFusion running on the same server, running on the same VM, same VPS. And it was actually hosted in Europe because this was from one of the sponsors from CF Hour when Dave and I were doing the podcast, and they gave us each a VPS that we could use for whatever we wanted. And I was like, okay, cool. I know what I'm doing. And it wasn't bad. I mean, if you consider the fact that the signal had to go across the ocean and then back again, the latency wasn't too bad, or the response time wasn't really too bad. But when I moved it to OCI, because I was able to move everything over and not have it cost me anything. That's one of the reasons why I didn't do anything initially, because I was like, if I went to some other cloud vendors, it'd be free for like a year, but then I'd have to start paying for it.
Mm-hmm.
And this site doesn't generate any revenue for me. It's just something that I do for the league that I'm in. And I discovered the OCI and the always free tier, and I was like, oh my God. And I've actually been running that now. Like I said, I think it's about 6 years I've been running on OCI, and I haven't paid a single penny for hosting. The one caveat is with the ARM architecture, and that's actually relatively new. So initially, I actually had regular Intel-based VMs or compute instances that I was running everything on. It was fine. And I wanted to use the ARM architecture because it allowed me to make them a little bit beefier if I needed to.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a hard time. And again, it could be fixed now. But when I first tried it, I had a very difficult time getting Lucy running, or actually getting it installed on the ARM architecture.
Oh,
thankfully, Command Box makes it very easy to run those types of instances on the ARM architecture without actually having to install it. So I actually use Command Box on the compute instances I have to run the site. And like I said, I'm using, I forget what it is. It might be 5289 possibly is the version of Lucy that I'm running. And I know people are going to be screaming, yes, I know it's behind, but it's one of those things where I don't, it's like this website gets used a lot, like 3 months out of the year, and then it kind of sits idle for. So it's not really a priority at this point for me to make sure everything's completely updated. So
makes sense. I would say for people listening, I do recommend updating Lucy or ColdFusion with hot fixes because the security issues that are out there, and you really don't want to have your site hacked. It can be very upsetting.
Right. Don't follow in my footsteps there.
But you're not alone there. A lot of people don't update their versions, of everything, whether it's Lucy or Adobe ColdFusion or MySQL or SQL Server, or
right.
At least on the cloud, they deal with the operating system. You don't have to worry about patches to that. That's all dealt with. And you didn't mention that earlier. My understanding with Oracle Cloud and all these cloud providers, they do quite a good job of keeping the thing secure.
Absolutely.
They apply patches.
And from the MySQL Heatwave side, so if you're running MySQL in Oracle Cloud as the database as a service, it is impossible without jumping through a lot of hoops to access that database server from the internet.
Good to hear.
So you don't have the database ports exposed to the internet. They're only exposed internally. So if you have your web application server in the same subnet, it's easy to connect them. It's easy to talk to each other, but you won't be able to actually have, without doing other steps. Like I actually have a bunch of instances that I play around with for work. And the way I access them is I actually created a compute instance where I installed OpenVPN. So I have an OpenVPN client on my laptop, and when I want to connect to my Heatwave instances for the work stuff, I connect to the VPN, and then I can actually just connect as if I was literally sitting in the same network. But by default, you can't access any MySQL Heatwave instances from the internet. You actually have to go through and manually do stuff, whether it's setting up a VPN like I did, or there's other processes. There's bastion connections that are time limited so that you can have access to do stuff, but then the bastion goes away, or it makes it, or I don't know if I can't remember if it goes away, if it becomes disabled, or it just starts throwing errors if you try to connect beyond the time that the bastion is supposed to be set up. So in terms of security that way, it's great. Sometimes it's a bit of a pain because I'm like, why can I hit the server? Oh, because I'm not connected to the VPN. Like, those types of things. It still hasn't, connecting to the VPN to connect to the database servers that I'm running hasn't really solidified in my mental workflow for doing stuff. But and with compute instances, the default communication is over SSH, and that gets set up automatically. As a matter of fact, when you create a compute instance, you can generate SSH keys, or you can use existing keys that you might already have to make it easy to connect over SSH.
Get detailed show notes on today's episode in your free CF Alive Modern ColdFusion Guide at teratech.com. That is teratech.com. Viva la CF Alive Revolution!
It's very important. So much hacking has happened. Even US government sites get that thing last year where a bunch of sites got hacked, and some corporations. Very important to pay attention to security.
Absolutely.
Set things up basically. And make backups so if you did unfortunately get hacked, you can't be held for ransomware. So,
right.
And have a disaster recovery plan that you actually test out occasionally and try and stand up. And this is one of the other advantages of cloud, right? Because if you're on physical hardware and you have a disaster recovery plan, your disaster recovery plan is you've got to stand up some servers somewhere. You're
right.
renting stood up servers somewhere. If you're on cloud and you've got your images back, you should be able to just press some buttons and redeploy to another cloud instance in another data server.
Absolutely. Yeah, you can. And with MySQL Heatwave, you can actually do point-in-time recovery.
Oh.
So you can actually say, I want to recover this database to 10:53 a.m. yesterday.
Wow.
And it'll be able to restore. Now, you do have to make sure that that's enabled when you set up the instance, which I think it's actually enabled by default, but I can't remember.
Yeah. I mean, I think my experience is cloud stuff generally doesn't go through a disaster quite as often as physical hardware does. Not that physical hardware does it that often, but
right.
I've been around long enough. I've seen it happen that, a hard drive goes out or some human element was involved and there was a dork up. But that can happen on cloud, but it's a lot rarer. But if it does, it's easier to recover.
Right. And cloud providers, I think, have much better monitoring than a lot of people do when they have stuff on premise. So I think they're able to identify a problem before it actually becomes a problem. I frequently get emails from Oracle Cloud saying, hey, we noticed a problem in your tenancy, but we're working on fixing it. And I'm like, okay, I didn't even notice anything. So it's like it seems like the cloud providers are able to head off a lot of potential issues before they actually impact a lot of customers. And what you said about having a disaster recovery plan is something that I tend to preach a lot about, even though I'm not a DBA. I still talk about that because you're right. And I've known a lot of people who are like, oh yeah, we have a disaster recovery plan. Have you tested it?
Mm-hmm.
No. How do
Yeah,
you know it
you
worked?
test it and you discover someone changed one of the passwords and things six
Exactly.
months ago and now it doesn't work, or you
Or
thought
what
things
happened
were
to me?
backing up, or you thought things were committed in the source control, but they really weren't. Or
Mhm.
you'd be amazed how many human factors can happen in these things.
Or what happened to me years ago in a job was the backup media
Hmm.
failed.
Yeah, that happens.
And it's like, okay, yeah, the backup succeeded, but
The
it's
media
unusable.
failed.
What do we do now? So
You know, I remember once working with a client and they had a really sophisticated backup plan. They had like 9 sets of tapes. I forget what cadence they had, once a day, and then every week there was an offsite, whatever, and blah, blah, blah. And then the human came in. I won't name the human's name, and they tried to restore, and the first one failed. And they picked the wrong option. Instead of picking restore, they picked destroy tape.
oh
So they
God.
went through 8 of the tapes, and finally there someone else said, can we look at this before you try the final and ninth and only remaining backup? And then they discovered they've not, it had been failing to restore for a human element.
Wow.
These things happen.
Indeed. Yeah, and it's really, really important to do it. And it makes it a lot easier in cloud. There's ways you can actually configure MySQL Heatwave to be what they call high availability. So if you create a MySQL Heatwave instance in Oracle Cloud and you say I want it to be highly available, then it
Hmm.
will actually it will automatically create an instance in every availability domain. Specify one of them as the primary, automatically replicate the data to the secondaries, and if the primary goes down, it will automatically
Hmm.
fail over to one of the secondaries.
Hmm.
And that's something that, you know,
That's
is
hard to set up.
literally a couple of mouse clicks when
Yeah.
you're spinning up your instance that would take a lot more work
Yeah, we've
if you're
set
doing
that
it
up
on-prem.
with, a master slave thing, and you're doing data
Primary,
shipping.
secondary. We don't use master slave anymore. Primary,
Oh,
secondary.
oh, okay. That
Or
naughty
sometimes it's
phrasing.
source and replica.
Yes.
So,
Okay. Well, I'm
um,
sorry.
but
I'm not very into that kind of we mustn't use certain words, cancel culture thing, but I get why people get upset. Um, but the point I was trying to make is if you've got 2 different data centers and you're trying to keep synced, it's a bit of a headache to set up.
yeah, it could be. Um, and a way the way a lot of data centers are set up. I know, like in Oracle Cloud, they have regions. So
Hmm.
there's a lot of places have an Ashburn region, and
Hmm.
then inside of the region we have what's called availability domains. And what a lot of people may not understand is even though the availability domains are in the same region, they're not in the same building, and they're usually fed by completely different sources. So
Hmm.
inside of a region, you might have 3 availability domains that are completely separate from each other. So they get their power
Hmm.
from separate places, they get their
Hmm.
internet connection from separate places, so that if one of them goes down, it doesn't affect the others.
Yeah, I've
And
seen data centers set up that kind of way from ColdFusion ISPs. There was an ISP in Baltimore that I toured their data center a long time ago, and it was amazing the redundancy they planned into there
yep.
and the systems they had. I mean, human systems, to make sure things were running good. And now you migrated this site from a VPS, and it was a Lucy site, right? Is that?
Yes.
Yeah, and it was running on MySQL on the VPS, or?
Yeah, they actually were both running on the same machine.
Okay. And so what were the issues you had in migrating up to Oracle Cloud that you had to solve?
So the biggest issue I had to solve initially was getting them set up on separate instances. So at the time when I first started, MySQL Heatwave, that wasn't an offering. So that's how long I've been hosting this. So I had to set up another instance for my database. So I have 2 instances that I use, one for the web server, one for the database that runs MySQL community. And really the biggest issue was I had to go and I had to change the data source to point to the different IP address rather than localhost. And that was really it. And then when I switched to the ARM architecture is when I had to go through and use command box to get Lucy to run, or more to the point, to be installed, because I couldn't install it with the ARM architecture back then. Again, it could be fixed right now, where I wouldn't need to use that. But it's been such a part of the way I'm doing it at this point that I don't think I'd ever go back, even if it was supported.
You make it sound like it's almost press a button and you could move to the Oracle Cloud for hosting. Not have to pay
close.
For hosting. I don't know if you're in that CF Programmers Facebook group. There's been a lot of discussions about who to host with, and because one of the hosting companies has been having issues, as you know. I'm going to choose not to say their name, but you can find out if you want to know. But a lot of people are every other week someone says, "Oh, who should I move my hosting to?" And maybe Oracle Cloud is an option in there for some people.
And a lot of times when I see those posts, I do say, listen, first of all, full disclosure, I work for Oracle, but Oracle Cloud has an amazing always free tier, and you can very easily spin up instances that are going to be able to run, decent sized ColdFusion applications pretty easily.
Yeah, because there are some people who they have, a bunch of small clients, and each of those small clients would be fine. They could open their Oracle. I don't know how many sites do you think you could get on one of these free tier things?
If you use the ARM architecture and you configured all your resources to one, you'd have the equivalent of 4 CPUs and 24 gigabytes of RAM.
Oh, well, that's pretty beefy.
Yeah, that's a pretty beefy server. I mean, you're not going to be able to run, sites like LinkedIn on something like that, but there's probably a lot more.
I don't think the owners of LinkedIn would permit it to be run on Oracle Cloud, given that Microsoft are the owners of LinkedIn.
I was talking about the size of the instance, not necessarily where it was located.
But if you just have some, small business sites or non-profit site, you probably could put quite a few on just one.
I would imagine so. And again, and a lot of it depends on the efficiency of the code and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But,
well, and if you couldn't, there's nothing stopping a small business, your client could open their own Oracle free tier account.
Yep.
A bit more.
And then you just manage it.
Could do that. And then you just
because when you create an Oracle Cloud account, you can actually allow other people to come in. So like for my personal account that I use for the golf league, one of the people that has access to that is my son. So if I ever needed his help with something, or I couldn't get to something and the server was down, he could actually log in and see what was going on. So you can grant access to other people even in your free tier.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Now I think it's exciting to have a totally free hosting cloud option available for, smaller sites or private, personal sites or open source projects. We were talking, I just want to pivot a little here. You said you were a paramedic, which kind of blew my mind, because ColdFusion programmer / non-DBA, DBA. I guess a paramedic, you're saving people's lives and rushing them off to hospital. So I guess that could overlap with being a DBA on occasion.
Yeah, I was a paramedic for 14 years before I became a developer.
Yeah, wow. Do you think that's helped you in your development career, that you had that experience?
Absolutely. And it's actually funny you mentioned this. And for anybody listening, we did not talk about this earlier, but I have actually been working on put together a keynote session that I've submitted to several different conferences, where the crux of it is, if you came into tech from another career, how you can tap into skills and attitudes you may have learned in that other career to make you better in tech. And I think there's a lot of things that I learned as a paramedic that make me good as a developer. And like one of the things I tell people all the time is, when production's down and, you're the person that has to fix it. So something is wonky in production and you happen to pick up the phone. That's pretty stressful. That can be like, especially if you're dealing with, high volume financial information, that's it can be a very stressful situation. And if you're not used to working under stress, that can make it much more difficult to get through the problem. Well, I don't think I'll ever be in a more stressful situation than performing CPR on the father of the bride at the reception in front of 300 people.
Oh my goodness.
That's for me, that's peak stress.
Are you saying he coded? He was technically not alive. He code blue, I think they call it, right?
It depends a bunch of different places, but so we were doing CPR on him. He collapsed right in the middle of the dance floor. His daughter was there.
Even though people are panicking, you have to stay calm at the point you're making.
Yes.
And keep on performing and maybe communicating a bit and telling them to back off when they are getting in your
Exactly.
face.
Yeah. And that's, it's one of the things where it's like, and I've actually done that more than once. So that's, and that is stressful. That is like, I don't think I've ever been more stressed than I have been on those particular points.
Really?
Yep.
I've seen people code. I was at an event where code blue, the heart stopped beating. I didn't do the CPR because, someone else was doing it. But, and I haven't been a paramedic. I did yoga teacher training and learned meditation and whatever. So I do tend to be pretty calm in quotes, high stress situations. And one time I was at an event in a kind of deserty part of New Mexico, and a mini tornado came by, and we were all, how they have those dust devil things. They're not real tornadoes. And we're like, oh, look at that. It's so cute. And then it comes to this big marquee, like a wedding tent type thing. And the tornado kind of hits it, and it killed the tornado. Tornado collapsed, but it collapsed the tent as well with 50 people underneath. And there were quite a few injuries and panic. And I was pretty calm. I just went and helped people as best I could. But then afterwards, about 2 hours later, after I'd finished helping people, that's when I kind of freaked out. Had to lie down.
And you know what? That's not uncommon. A lot of like one of the things like when we had instances like that where, there were a lot of people around, or there were a lot of people who were hurt. Yeah. They're looking to you.
Yeah.
To make, not necessarily make sense, but to try and bring the temperature down. Yeah. So if you walk into a scene and you're all amped up, that's going to make everybody else more amped up, which is going to make your job harder. So I always tried to, first of all, I never ran, because to me, when you're running, like when I see like EMS workers on TV and they're running, I'm like, no, that's stupid, because that shows you're out of control. It doesn't show you're in control of the situation. If there's chaos raining down and you walk in calmly, guess what? That brings the temperature down, and people now look to you. Okay, this guy knows what he's doing, so we're going to listen to what they have to say. Yeah.
And if you're a programmer with a bug that's the site's down and the people in the company are upset, that's probably a good way to behave.
Yep. Because again, if you're working on a bug trying to get production back up and you're freaking out, that's going to make the people above you not feel good about the situation.
Yeah, just like the daughter of the father who was having a heart attack. Yep. He doesn't want to have the CPR paramedic freaking out.
Exactly.
Ooh, did I remember my training right? Or is it the left hand or the right? No, it's calm competence and
exactly. And that, it's one, and that's just one thing that I think, helped me become a better developer. I actually have always prided myself on my troubleshooting skills. And I think a lot of that comes from doing, in medicine, you do what's called a differential diagnosis. So you get some information and you come up with an idea, and then you gather more information to see if your idea is correct. And if your idea is not correct, well, then you got to come up with another idea. And then so differential diagnosis is more, you keep checking for things. And when you realize that, it can't be something, then you knock it off the list until eventually what's left is the only thing that makes sense.
Got it. That makes sense for debugging.
Exactly. Yeah. It's really, that's kind of like, you kind of get a sense like this kind of sounds like a network issue. or it kind of sounds like it's an environment issue. So like it happens on one server, doesn't happen on another server type thing. And, you just, that's kind of the way I work through when I'm tackling bugs is, I take in what's happening. Okay. So what's happening? What's expected to happen? And you're like, okay, this sounds like it could be this. And then you test to see if it is that. And then when you're like, oh, it's not that. But then you're like, oh, but now I have more information. Now it could be this. And you keep going through that iterative process. And it's very similar to, when you have a patient that's presenting with symptoms that could be any number of issues.
Yeah, they're lying down on the floor, not conscious. But is it because their heart stopped? Is it because they had some food allergy? Is it,
exactly. You just got to keep knocking stuff off the list, but you got to try and prioritize that list so that it makes sense. What's the most likely scenario here? That's the problem.
Right. And then you focus on that, find evidence. Is this really true? Did this fix make it better? Or, oh, maybe it isn't. Maybe we need to go to the second possibility here.
Right.
And try it.
And sometimes there's multiple things going on. So you fix one thing and you're like, oh, wait, that problem's gone, but now there's another one. And it's the same thing in medicine. Sometimes, you fix one thing and it exposes another issue.
Definitely happens with debugging. It's like whack-a-mole sometimes. You fix one thing and then that reveals, particularly with performance tuning, I find if a server's running slow or crashing, you get rid of one database issue and then you discover there's some locking issue in the code or whatever the thing is. So yeah, often, and even in debugging, that can be true. Very true. Do you, I've got to believe in paramedics. You kind of access your intuition as to what you should do. It's not necessarily totally rational thought process. You just get a feeling as to what you should do first.
Right. Yeah. And unfortunately, that's not something that can be taught. That only comes with experience. And like another thing, like something that you hear in medicine a lot is when you hear hoofbeats, don't look for zebras. And basically what that means is like, if you're presented with something, then look and see if it's the most likely thing first.
Right.
But where the experience comes in is when you get that gut instinct that I know it's not that. I can't tell you why. I can't quantify why, but I just have a feeling it's not that. It's that. And that's something that it comes with experience. I saw thousands of patients in my career. So I had a lot of different things, go wrong on calls or where we thought it was one thing wound up being another thing. And, it's just, and it's kind of the same way with coding. Like nobody's going to come out of school and be a great coder. It's not going to happen. You learn to be a great coder by coding and by making mistakes and learning from those mistakes.
Yeah.
And constantly learning and evolving how you do things. Like I have a way that I like to code, but it's not my way. It's a way that I piece together from a bunch of people I work with over the years. That,
it's not just learning from your mistakes. If you're lucky with a team and you get to see other people's codes and see other people's mistakes and you do whatever you call it, post-mortem.
Post-mortem, yeah.
Yeah, but I think there's pretty a term. Code review, I think, is what you do something where you look at what other people did and you learn from what other people did, or you help them understand, well, maybe that's not the best way to code that or whatever.
So it's funny. I was on a project before I joined Oracle, and I was brought on the project because of my expertise in CF. The project was using CF to set up basically microservices to power an Angular JS app. And we did regular code reviews. And most of the developers did not like when I reviewed their code.
They didn't. Why not?
Because I would find a lot of things wrong with it. And I will admit,
isn't that good?
Well, yeah, but they always felt bad because it's like, Scott never has to fix his code and I always have to fix mine. And I'm like, well,
I mean,
this
is sort of like, someone not wanting to go to the dentist because they're afraid the dentist might find some things that need fixing, and so they don't go to the
Exactly.
dentist for 10 years, and then their whole mouth falls apart because they didn't go to the dentist. Wouldn't it be better to just go every 6 months for a little preventative checkup and find
Right.
the problems in your code preventatively? And
It's funny. There was one guy, one developer who they said this multiple times in the 3 years I was on the project, and they were like, I always like reviewing Scott's code or getting my code reviewed by Scott because I always learn something. Like whether it's a new way, he never had used ternary operators before, and I love ternary operators. I use them all the time. And like the first time he did code review, he was like, "What's that?" Like, "Oh, it's ternary operator." He goes, "How's it work?" And I told him, he's like, "Oh, that's nice." And then he started using them, and it was just one of those things where, I say people didn't want me to review their code. That was, you didn't get a choice. You couldn't pick who reviewed your code. It was kind of assigned, and
I think it's good to rotate it a bit because different people have different things they spot,
Right. And, for me, it's like, I tend to think beyond what the problem is. So if there's a particular issue or there's a new feature that needs to be added, I don't want to think, does it just solve this problem or does it solve these problems? And if it solves these problems, we need to make sure that that particular snippet of code can handle multiple different things and not just the specific thing that we're looking at right here. And I think that's what a lot of developers, especially younger developers, lack, because it's not something that's really taught. I don't even know if it's something that can be taught, is to think bigger picture. So I've worked on projects where developers were like, they had blinders on, and if they had to do something, they did it just so it fulfilled the requirements that they were given. And they don't think to themselves, is this something somebody else can use? And if it is something somebody else can use, how can I write it in a way to make it so that it solves my problem and solves theirs?
Yeah, that is a skill. I think experience on open source can help with that.
Yep. Absolutely.
We put out in our State of the Union survey, are you using open source in your company, or, is it allowed or whatever? I encourage everyone to do a bit of open source stuff, either with code in your company, if you're allowed to, because if you've solved a simple little problem inside your organization, why not share it with others,
Yep.
And the reason is, putting it out there will probably make it better code because you're going to do a little bit of a better job on the code to start with. And then other people will give you feedback or pull requests, and
absolutely,
the code will get better. So
that's what I tell. That's what, like, I've had several conferences where there's been students that were there, and I get to talking to them, and they were like, what do you think is the best thing I can do to help before I get into an interview? And I said, take every line of code you've ever written and put it on GitHub. I said, even if you think it's bad, put it out.
Right.
I said, because what's going to happen is people will see it. And if it's not good, for lack of a better word, then they're going to let you know, and then you're going to learn something. I said, now you have to remember, when you do that, you gotta put on some thick armor, because some people can be mean and nasty in their comments and be like, this is stupid, this is horrible, rather than offer constructive criticism. But when you do get those constructive criticisms, that's how you learn. We don't learn from our successes. We learn from when we don't succeed.
Probably learn more. It's the same thing. I'm sure when you were a paramedic, you had one or two patients who actually croaked in the process.
More often than not, probably. When CPR was done, probably more often than not.
Yeah. And you can't take it personally. You learn from it. You do your best you can.
Yep.
But the whole point is, you're like, okay, maybe there's something I could learn here. Either the approach, you can't save everyone, right? That's one of the lessons I think you learn.
Right.
There are just some people who are ready to go to wherever people go after they die.
It's just their time.
Yeah, it's just their time to go to heaven. And there are other people it isn't their time. And you were telling me this story about I don't know if you're okay sharing this on the show, but you said there was someone who had tried to kill themselves a few times.
Yeah, I had there was a female patient, and I just happened to be working these 3 times that she tried to kill herself. Now, I don't want to belittle this, but there are times when people make it look like they're trying to kill themselves, and it's kind of like a cry for help. It's kind of like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm at my wit's end and this is something I'm actually considering, but they
Yeah,
don't really put
that's
their
pretty
whole
common.
effort. It is very common, and I don't like when people get belittled for that, because to me that is like the ultimate cry for help, because the next time they get like that, guess what? They're not going to cry for help. They're actually going to do it. But
Yeah.
this was not that. All three times, she like had thought out what she was going to do and she planned it, and just things went wrong. Like, so if the first time, she decided she was going to take a bunch of pills and drink some alcohol, and that she would just go to sleep and never wake up. The problem was she drank too much. She wasn't used to drinking, and she vomited, and she vomited up most of the pills. So while she did go to sleep, she did eventually wake up as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the second time, she actually got a hold of a family member's gun, and she went out into the woods behind her house. She put the gun to her head and she pulled the trigger, and the gun misfired. So she wound up with like burns and stuff on her hand, and
Wow.
nothing else happened. And then the third time, she was on a highway and she stepped in front of a bus, and the bus was actually able to not stop completely, but slow down enough to the point where when it hit her, it gave her some bumps and bruises, but didn't cause any long lasting damage. And I was working all three times she did this, and I
Wow.
was in the back of the ambulance with her all three times. And on the third time, she was like, "You must just think I'm ridiculous." And I'm like, "I don't think you're ridiculous at all. I
Mm-hmm.
just want you to realize that the universe isn't done with you yet.
Mm-hmm.
You're meant to be here. You're not meant to leave us yet." And as far as I know, she never attempted it again. This was actually in a small coastal town in New Jersey, and the groups of medics that we all worked with were kind of tight knit. So we all kind of knew like the frequent flyers, and that was a girl that people knew about because, what are the odds the same person, me, was on all three times. So I
Mm.
had never heard anything else that happened with her. So I'm hoping that, she continued on and, died eventually of natural causes if she's not still alive.
Yeah, I think there's usually a message there in this. I've interviewed people who've had near-death experiences where they coded, their heart stopped beating for some period of time. In the case of that, they actually saw some light, saw some dead
Hmm.
relatives, met with God, and they really liked it. They said, "Oh, this is a great place. Can I stay?" And God's like, "No, not your time. You need to go back." And
Right.
here are some tips. In the case of this woman I interviewed, this is another podcast I have, and I'll put it in the show notes for anyone who's curious on it. She was trained. She was at school, university, and she was training to be an attorney. She didn't really enjoy it. She was doing a lot of drugs. This is how she died. She was driving a car high, had an accident, broke her back in three places, died on the operating table. Remember details of what was on the operating table. I mean, she was unconscious. How she could have done that? And then, she was told to come back and be a teacher. So that's what she did. And now she's a lot happier. She
Wow.
really wasn't happy being an attorney. Nothing against attorneys who enjoy it, but, it wasn't for her. So it's quite amazing. But I just want to say that, same with some programs, some programs, it's their time to die.
Hmm.
Sometimes
I
they
agree.
like get a reprieve. And I think that's the case with ColdFusion. There seemed to be a bit of I don't know that ColdFusion coded, but it did have a bit of a hiccup around CF9, 12 years ago or whatever it was.
Hmm.
And it does seem to, I don't know if you were there as a paramedic, Scott, or someone else was, but I think the folks at Adobe and Lucy and at Altis and me at TerraTech and, a few other folks out there just said, no, we're not going to let this language die. We're going to,
Right.
it's still got
And
here.
I have to say that a lot of the stuff that Ortis puts out is fantastic. Like, I love command blocks. Like, to me, that's just like, you know, somebody's like, "Hey, can you help me troubleshoot this issue? What version of CF are you using?" "Oh, well, you can't download it anymore." So I don't care. Just tell me what version you're using. Because you can use command box, just spin up an instance and, look at their code. And it's just, I love tools like that. And I wish that's something that we had in the CF world years and years and years ago. But the CF community, while I'm not as an active member as I was before, has always been deeply passionate about the language and the ecosystem. And I think what Luis and everybody else at Ortus has done is kind of elevate everybody.
Absolutely.
And I just it's nice to see, from somebody who I promote an open source product, because I'm actually on the community team. My main focus is supposed to be the open source version, but we do kind of bleed over and talk about some of the other stuff. I really like a lot of what the CF community is doing, and it's funny. I've been doing a lot of Node coding recently, and more than once I've thought to myself, this is what the CF community could have been, with all the different Node packages that are available. It's like, if you want to try and do something with computer code, there's a better than fair chance there's a Node module to accomplish that. So you don't have to, rewrite, or you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And like, there's been so many times, like, I thought to myself, I'm like, wow, if CF was like this, I'd still be using it all the time. And I haven't been as involved, so I don't really know a whole lot about some of the differences of the, what's come about in the most recent versions of CF, other than like the big highlights I'll see coming across Facebook or, on LinkedIn. But there was a time with CF where they'd come out every year, or every new version, there'd be features, and I'd be like, I have no use for that. Or, it's funny. You said CF9. I think CF9 was when the Flash forms came out. Was that 9 or was that 8?
I don't remember what version Flash forms.
But like, either way, whenever Flash forms came out, I'm like, wow, this is really cool. Like, wow, Flash forms are really cool. This is neat. And then you hit that 25 kilobyte size restriction, and you're like, okay, this is now useless. I can't do this now. So if you made a form that was too big, it would throw an error because the actual generated file couldn't be larger than like 25 kilobytes or something. So, but I still like what the people in the community do, even though I'm not using the language every day like I used to. It really makes me feel good to know that there are people who are still promoting and supporting CFML, whether it's ColdFusion or Lucy, and just, it makes me feel good. Like it's almost like, in a way, and this is going to come across as patronizing, and I don't mean it to be, but in a way, it's like watching your child grow. Like, some of the people that I know are big into the community now were like just starting out when I was more prominent in the community. So it's really cool to see those people grow and become such a huge part of the community. That was a big part of my life for a long time.
It's good. And if you're able to mentor people or just encourage them in some way, it's great to see people grow and do that.
Absolutely.
Share stuff on their social media or blog about it or come on podcasts. Anyone listening who wants to come on the podcast, just let me know. Happy to chat with you and see if it's a good fit. Mostly it is. I am pretty open to interviewing folks, as you know, Scott.
Indeed.
And I think the other, I mean, to me, when I look at all the different programming languages, really there's quite a big overlap as to what you can do. Yeah, sometimes it's easier in some languages than others. Like ColdFusion is good for rapidly producing stuff. But also there's the importance of the ecosystem and all the tools that you have and packages that you have. And that's a big part of it. And then, as you mentioned, the community of people is important and how positive and supportive that is. So I would suggest to anyone listening, if you haven't looked at ForgeBox and the packages on there, that's another Ortus thing. And it's kind of, I think they kind of basically looked at what Node packages did or what WordPress plugins did, that how can we do something similar in ColdFusion? So that's a good thing. there. And I think there's a lot of cross-pollination between different languages and ecosystems. People see a feature in one language or a tool somewhere, and they're like, oh, how could we reproduce that?
Right.
Good to have that going on. But I mean, for me, ColdFusion is definitely alive. We've got two major organizations, Adobe and the Lucy Foundation, on the open source side, supporting it, committed to doing new releases and new versions. Adobe's currently pumping out a new version every year. Lucy puts out a monthly point release.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's always, Into the Box conferences coming up in Washington, D.C. In May. And, they always have new tools that are announcing version roadmaps. It's like very refreshing. When I've gone to that conference, I always come away like, wow, you can do that in ColdFusion, and there's this tool and there's this technique, and
right.
And the same thing, there's a CF Summit East happening in Northern Virginia. That's in end of April, I think. So
yep.
Another East Coast event. And then, of course, we've got the CF Camp in Europe in June, and we've got the CF Summit West or Las Vegas happening later in the year. And there's one or two other ColdFusion events and conferences happening around the world. I think there's one in Malaysia and there's one in Latin America somewhere.
None of them hold a candle to CF United, though.
Oh, well, that's very kind of you to say. Well, CF United was a very special conference. We had a lot of great help from all the staff that put it together and all the speakers and sponsors. So it was a very fun event. But again, I was very sad after CF United in 2011 when it ended. But I think these, events have a natural lifetime.
Right.
Unfortunately, that was what happened there. It got a bit of a fatal wound in the 2008 financial crisis, and it kind of limped along a bit.
Right.
But I'm sure it's in conference heaven, having a good time with all the other conferences that have ended. So cool. Anything else you want to share before we wrap up here?
No. You know what? I do. For anybody who's a younger developer, newer developer, who's kind of just starting out, two things. One, don't get discouraged. Keep trying, keep learning. And two, don't be afraid to not succeed. And I actually said that to somebody, and they were like, so don't be afraid to fail. And I'm like, no, don't be afraid not to succeed. Because a lot of times when you don't succeed, you're going to learn something. And if you learn something, there's no way that can be considered a failure.
Absolutely. And it's always an experience, right?
Yep.
I would say it's worth trying stuff in programming or anything. You're probably going to learn a bunch of new things. You're going to make some new friends if you go about learning it with other people. But you're always going to have an experience and probably have a story to tell from it. I mean, I'm sure you've had programming quotes adventures where it was a total cluster F, but you've got a good story out of it, and you probably avoid doing the same thing again. So you probably did learn something from it.
Absolutely. Yep.
So I think it's, I don't know quite what the name for that attitude is, like open mind to trying stuff or versus closed mind. Mm-hmm. I think I've heard it described that way, but definitely, I mean, for me, I've often thought, what's the meaning of life? Why are we here? I know we're getting a bit deep here for people. And I think we're here to learn and grow and have experiences, have different experiences. And that's basically it. Maybe other people have other views on that. But those are the two key things I picked up. And sometimes those experiences can be a bit dark.
Yeah, especially working in EMS for 14 years.
Well, even in programming, there can be some pretty, one time I was an honorary network admin on a VAX system, and I'd given permissions to some folders, and I was like, yeah, that's not good for security. I need to remove permissions. Well, I didn't realize I was removing permissions from the whole effing machine. And suddenly the whole team of 50 people couldn't do their work. Like,
yikes.
Yeah, that was not. I didn't ever do that again. But the chief sysadmin, he must have been an an EMF or paramedic in a past career, because he was very calm and he just said, "Oh well, no worries, we'll just restore the permissions." 30 minutes later, everyone was able to work again.
Yep.
And yeah, that was one of my more embarrassing little whatever. And I've done some pretty stupid things in programming over the years as well, along with clever things. That's how we learn.
Exactly. That's how you learn.
I'm going to put all those, CFR, Oracle Cloud, the URL for the free Oracle Cloud, which is so complicated. It's oracle.com/cloud/free. I don't know how anyone could possibly remember it. We're going to put it on the show notes at the terratech.com site. The CFR URL is long and complicated. You're not going to find that otherwise. I'm also going to put, for anyone feeling a bit depressed or suicidal, I did an episode with Jorge Reyes called CF Suicide, on some tips to do with that and some resources. So I'm going to put that in there because we did bring that subject up. And I'll put a link to that episode I did with the person who died and came back, on my other podcast, Intuitive Leadership Mastery. And I'll put a link to the Into the Box and CF Summit conferences as well. So if folks want to reach you online, what are the best ways to do that, Scott?
Probably the best way is on LinkedIn. I'm pretty liberal when it comes to accepting connection requests. They can even email me directly at scott.stroz@oracle.com.
I will put the URLs for both those in the show notes so people can easily find them. And thanks so much for coming on the show today, Scott. It's been a blast.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, it's been really good. Kind of going down memory lane a little bit, but I enjoyed it. Thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by TerraTech, the ColdFusion experts. Develop, secure, optimize. Get detailed show notes on today's episode and your free CF Alive Modern ColdFusion Guide at terratech.com. That is TERATECH.com. And now back to today's show.